This Liberal government just has no legitimacy or credibility on matters of freedom of expression, which is why Canadians from across the political spectrum, from different religious backgrounds, have been so united in their opposition to Bill C-9. The Liberals are sending a conscious and concerted message that religious teaching is now fair game for prosecution, that religious teaching and religious scriptures could constitute hate. And interesting, Lori Idlout was the NDP justice critic. She gave a very impassioned speech about Bill C-9 at second reading in the House, and she talked about how this bill will allow the Liberal government to go after peaceful protest and to silence political dissent. And she was right. I was there cheering for Marilyn Gladu when she got up in the House of Commons and talked about how this bill was an all-out assault on civil liberties. And she said that members of the Liberal Party actually want her in jail for her religious belief. And then, a few weeks later, she put on a red dress and that was that.
Journalism and commentary 1 year anniversary.
I don't believe journalism being funded by the government is the solution.
You have to rebuild the foundation.
You have to retell the story.
Market conservative
Other news that actually matters.
I hence wanted to ask. I think they should answer their questions, especially if they're politically charged.
It's a dark day in Canada. Bill C-9 is set to become law. Today, members of Parliament rejected a last-minute attempt to kill Bill C-9 that was put forward by MP Andrew Lawton, a Conservative, and they voted to approve the Senate amendments, sending the bill to Royal Assent, where it will officially become law. This is a very dark day for both freedom of speech and freedom of religion. A quick overview of what this bill does from the Canadian Constitution Foundation. Bill C-9 creates a new standalone hate offense, and even minor regulatory breaches could be turned into serious crimes if labeled, quote, motivated by hatred, unquote. This bill also criminalizes the display of certain symbols that the government deems offensive, even though outlawing specific images will not end hate, but it will simply drive it underground and make it harder to confront. And most concerningly, it threatens religious discourse by removing defenses for good faith religious expression, which risks criminalizing honest discussions based on deeply held belief. Conservative MP Michelle Rempel-Garner takes it a step further. She said that with the amendment that removes a 50-year-old exemption that shielded good faith religious belief from hate crime charges is effectively a criminalization of religious belief. Initially, this exemption, which again was 50 years old, while Bill C-9 was amended to include that removal to appease the separatist Bloc Québécois when the Liberals were still in a minority parliament. But now that they're in a majority government, they don't need to appease the Quebec separatists anymore, but they've decided to keep that amendment anyways. And Minister of Canadian Identity and Culture, Mark Miller, well, he said the quiet part out loud when he labeled parts of the Bible as hateful. Think about that, calling the Bible hateful. What is also shameful is that all 5 floor crossers, which I will name Christian Tremont, Michael Ma, Lori Idlout, Matt Genereux, and Marilyn Gladu, they all voted against killing Bill C-9, and they all voted for adopting the Senate's amendment, sending the bill to Royal Assent. All 5 of these people are complicit in this bill passing, a bill that critics have warned will criminalize religious beliefs. And a reminder that none of these people ever ran as a Carney Liberal. They betrayed their constituents, and now they are complicit in the passage of C-9. To discuss this and other concerning pieces of legislation that the Liberals are putting forward is MP Andrew Lawton. Andrew was the MP who tried to kill Bill C-9 at the last minute, which unfortunately failed. And Andrew Lawton has been one of the most outspoken supporters of freedom of speech, both at his time as a broadcaster at True North, where we worked together, and now as a politician. But before we get to today's must-watch interview, be sure you are subscribed, as up to 80% of my viewers are not subscribed. I'm trying to get to 20,000 subscribers. It means a lot. Let's support independent media. Hype and like the video, hit the notification bell, and consider getting a paid channel membership for less than $5 a month, as I am one of the only journalists left in this country that refuses to take subsidies from the federal government. Andrew Lawton, thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, good to talk to you again, Ellie. Thank you.
So let's start with talking about Bill C9. I know this is something that you were very, very active throughout the entire process. It's the bill on hate, but the big concern, of course, is that it removes a religious exemption to hate crime charges. What's the latest on Bill C9? I hear you attempted to kill the bill altogether. So what's going on?
Yeah, and I'll just say, I mean, the issues with Bill C9 extend far beyond just the removal of the so-called religious defense. This is a bill that introduces redundant provisions that are already illegal in other laws, oftentimes laws that are not enforced by police now, which raises the question of, if we have that issue on the books, why are our new laws going to achieve something different? And then we also look at, as you mentioned, the removal of longstanding protections for religious speech and some other really critical questions that we tried to get resolved through amendments to the bill that the Liberals rejected, such as how their new standalone hate provision will apply to even non-criminal acts, and even this ban on hate symbols, how that will actually be applied in practice, given that it is already illegal to use a hate symbol if you are breaking the law, if you are doing it to incite hatred, which is already illegal. So the Liberals have failed to really answer for these. And it isn't just, Bible verses that could end up facing scrutiny under this. It's all people of faith. It's all people expressing a political view. And I'll share with you, and I don't think it's a surprise to you that I think this way, but this Liberal government just has no legitimacy or credibility on matters of freedom of expression, which is why Canadians from across the political spectrum, from different religious backgrounds, have been so united in their opposition to Bill C9.
Yes, for sure. That's a good point. In this new reality, in a Bill C9 reality, what does that look like for pastors as they look to preach on the Bible?
Well, look, I've always been clear that this is not going to lead to a situation in which Bill C9 passes and, police cars are rolling through towns up and down the countryside, arresting pastors and imams and rabbis. It's not like that. But I am very concerned that the bill will have a chilling effect when people are preaching about matters that may be subject to debate within society and even within places of worship, on things like sexuality and what sin is and geopolitics, things where people of faith have sincere beliefs, people of different political persuasions do, and there will be a chilling effect. And we also have to look at how this will intersect with other things, such as regulations the Liberals are trying to put forward on the internet, for example. So I think this is a concern, and we have to be very mindful of the fact that by removing the religious defense, the Liberals are sending a conscious and concerted message that religious teaching is now fair game for prosecution, that religious teaching and religious scriptures could constitute hate. And the message that's sending to law enforcement across the country, to houses of worship, and to civil society groups that might be very hostile to certain religions, that may try to now weaponize this process by filing complaints, which we saw previously under the Human Rights Act. Like, these are all concerns that we have to be very mindful of. My hope is that everything stays as it is now, but we actually enforce the laws where they're being broken right now, when people are calling for genocide on the streets, when people are threatening harm against the Jewish community or other communities. Let's enforce those laws.
Yes, for sure. So, since the election, we've had multiple floor crossers: Christy Entremont, Michael Maw, Matt Genru, Marilyn Gladu. They are now part of a government that is passing Bill C9, that is putting the chills on religious communities that you just talked about. What do you make of the fact that these were your colleagues and they're now part of a government that's doing this?
Well, we'll see if cooler heads prevail. At the time we're recording this, we're a couple of hours away from what are likely to be the final votes on C9. I have moved an amendment that will scrap the bill altogether. It will discharge the bill and withdraw this very divisive and toxic piece of legislation. I mean, you mentioned people that have crossed the floor from the Conservatives. There has also been Laurie Idlout from the NDP. And interesting, Laurie Idlout was the NDP justice critic. She gave a very impassioned speech about Bill C9 at second reading in the House, and she talked about how this bill will allow the Liberal government to go after peaceful protest and to silence political dissent. And she was right. I was there cheering for Marilyn Gladu when she got up in the House of Commons and talked about how this bill was an all-out assault on civil liberties. And she said that members of the Liberal Party actually want her in jail for her religious belief. And then, a few weeks later, she put on a red dress and that was that. So it will be fascinating to see if Lori and Marilyn will now get up and pretend that everything they said, and I believe sincerely believed about Bill C-9, is now wrong just because Sean Fraser and Mark Gerritsen and Mark Carney are telling them to vote for this legislation. I think that will be very interesting for me to watch, and more importantly for their constituents and Canadians to see.
I think the whole thing is shameful, and it's part of why a lot of people don't have faith in politicians anymore, is when they do opportunistic things like that. But I mean, I could go and rant on the entire day about my frustration with floor crossers, Andrew. Let's talk about Bill C-22 now, another concerning and bad bill, in my opinion, at least. So the Liberal government, they've threatened to block any further debate on Bill C-22, and they're trying to speed up the process to try to get it passed as soon as possible. This is a bill, for those who don't remember, they say it's for safety, but it could undermine privacy and require companies to retain data, and there's concerns about weakening encryption protections that are really critical online privacy tools, and it will give the government surveillance powers. What are your thoughts on what the government's doing with Bill C-22?
The problem is that the government will often provide a piece of legislation that they say is aimed at addressing one problem, and we would agree with the solution conceptually to that problem, but they always embed in the bill these poison pills, things that make it impossible to support. And I think C-22 is a great example of this, where when the bill first came out, I've had conversations with law enforcement in my riding about their frustrations with the status quo, the time it can take to get production orders, to get subscriber information. And I spoke to them, and they welcomed a lot of what the government had announced. And a lot of that, though, in fact, almost all of what the police I spoke to were asking for is in part one of the bill. It's a two-part bill. Part one deals with being able to confirm that Ellie is a subscriber of Bell, so that if you've done something wrong and there's a warrant for you, they know that they have to supply Bell with that production order. It's speeding up a step in between getting a production order and the beginning of an investigation. And this is very legitimate. It's subject to judicial authorization and oversight. The problem with part two of the bill is that the Liberals are trying to insert their own backdoors and vulnerabilities into electronic communication systems in Canada, which is subject to a huge amount of abuse and ministerial discretion, not judicial discretion. And we've heard from some of the tech companies. And by the way, I mean, I have had a lot of disagreements over the years with the Facebooks and the Googles of the world, because I don't think they have a great track record on protecting privacy. But they have certainly been clear about wanting to protect user privacy from state intrusion. And when they're saying we cannot safeguard our system if we impose these mechanisms that the government will force us to do on C-22, Canadians have to be very concerned. But I think it's most important to acknowledge that that was not what law enforcement was asking for. Law enforcement was asking for what we have offered time and time again to the Liberals in committee and the House of Commons to pass without issue, which is part one of the bill, so that we can actually give the proper scrutiny and debate to the second part of the bill, which is where almost all of the controversy has stemmed.
Yeah, for sure. And you touched on a good point here. I mean, this is the government's whose vague bill on MAID has led to a MAID disaster. This is the government whose vague and bad immigration policies have led to an immigration disaster. Time and time again, we have seen case after case of them introducing a bill. Marijuana is another example. The amount of young people I know that have had psychosis because they've had marijuana since it's been legalized. This whole issue is a story that is so sickening. They just don't have a good track record. Every single time, they'll claim they want to do something good. They'll introduce a bill. Conservatives will say they're concerned about it. The Liberals are like, oh, no, don't worry. And then every time we're proven right. And I'm kind of personally a skeptic now. And I think, unfortunately, every time there has been legitimate concern that has been ignored, that legitimate concern has actually come out to be true. Another bill that's just been introduced, Bill C-34, the idea behind that one is to restrict kids' access to social media. I think the idea that kids shouldn't be on social media as an idea has gotten more popular in recent years. I spoke to Jonathan Haidt a year ago, and he's a psychologist that doesn't believe kids should have social media or even have cell phones. But there are concerns about how the Carney government's going to go after this with Bill C-34. So what are your thoughts on Bill C-34 and the government mandating a
Well,
ban for
I will
kids?
say I haven't had a chance to really go through it with a fine tooth comb yet. It's a 90 some odd page bill. I will say perfectly up front that I share the concerns that parents have been raising across the country that young people, children are being exposed to incredible amounts of harm on the internet. Parents do not feel equipped or informed enough to deal with that under the status quo. So I think that we need to do something to support parents and we need to acknowledge those harms, which are very real. And just to be frank about this, we were talking about this over a year ago. My colleague Michelle Rempel Garner introduced a bill C-216, which was, I think, a very useful and very strong conservative answer to the last two parliaments in which the Liberals introduced these really draconian online harms acts. Bill C-36 originally, and then later C-63. And in Bill C-216 from Michelle, we weren't talking about regulating content or restricting what people can post online. We were talking about creating a duty of care where there is a legal obligation that these tech companies would have to acknowledge and address the harms on their platform, especially when we're talking about some of the really aggressive bullying, distribution of deep fakes and non-consensual images and whatnot. And we already have that. That's something the Liberals could adopt at any given moment. I will say on C-34, one of the concerns I have looking early on is that this isn't just a bill about limiting the exposure of young people to online harms. It's a bill that brings back a lot of what was in the old Online Harms Act, notably this idea of regulating hate speech, introducing a digital safety commission, which would be a bureaucracy that would try to oversee some of these internet regulations. And a lot of these policies were the ones that were the most controversial in the previous Online Harms Acts, and they seem to have been brought back. So this is, again, another one of these situations where I'm concerned that the Liberals are trying to say that a bill does one thing while introducing a lot of other things that really need to be looked at as part of a separate discussion. But as I said, this is still very early. My colleagues and I are still looking through this. Our critic on the Heritage File, Rachel Thomas, has done some tremendous work on this already, and I'm happy to support because I've been around before I was in politics long enough that I've covered many past attempts by the Liberals to take more control of the internet. So I'm very skeptical with anything they do on this file, having seen what their tendencies are.
Right. It also becomes almost like a weaponization thing where it's like they'll introduce a bill that, as we argued before, like maybe the stated end is good. Okay, we want to protect kids from online harms. We want to protect, Jewish communities from anti-Semitic hate, et cetera, et cetera. But then they put all these other bad things in the bill. So then when the conservatives vote against it, they're able to say, oh, look, conservatives voted against protecting children, right? And the problem with that is that at the end of the day, the legislators are supposed to put in policies that benefit Canada, not that are designed to just make your opponent look bad. So that's just kind of my 2 cents on that. There's going to be a recommendation against expanding MAID to mental illness. I know that this is something that you have been very vocal about. You were very vocal about it at your time as a broadcaster. You've continued to be very vocal about it as a politician. What are your thoughts on this recommendation? Because if Parliament doesn't intervene, next year we're going to have MAID for mental illness.
So I sit on the Special Joint Committee on Medical Assistance in Dying, which was tasked with reviewing the incoming expansion of MAID for people with mental illness. And you're right when you set the stage by saying that if nothing happens, if no laws are changed or adopted, mental illness will become an eligibility criterion alone for people as of March next year. I will say, as a member of that committee, I cannot comment on the contents of our report before that report is tabled. That is privileged. But what I can say is that if anyone watches the testimony we heard, in my view, what we heard was a lot of what conservatives have been sounding the alarm about for many years, which is that if we expand MAID to include people with mental illness, we're going to be allowing people to end their lives who could be and need to be helped and supported in their journey. Physicians, specifically psychiatrists, testified on this committee that it was impossible to distinguish between someone who is suicidal as a symptom of a mental illness versus someone who may go into a doctor and make a good faith request for MAID under this system. They also said it's very difficult to determine irremediability, this idea that a mental illness could be permanent in the way that MS or ALS could be, psychiatrists very much disagreed with. And My hope, regardless of the report in the committee process, is that members of parliament will support the Conservative bill that's already been put forward to address this, which is Tamara Jansen's Bill C-218, the Right to Recover Act, which will stop very simply and very cleanly the forthcoming expansion of MAID to people with mental illness.
Yes, let's hope that that passes because, I mean, it's already been a disaster without that addition, and there's already ways that people have been able to use MAID because they can't afford rent, because they're unhappy. That's without it actually being legal. We're heading down a very dark path if this continues, in my opinion. Andrew, we've been talking about liberal bills. Let's talk about your bill now. You just tabled a bill yourself, a private member's bill, that would remove taxes on used cars. So we know that used car prices have gone up quite a lot in the last few years. So tell me why you thought this bill was important.
Well, you basically gave away the answer in the lead up there. It's not just a lot; they've almost doubled. From 2019 to now, the price of a used car has doubled. The average used car is now over $36,000. And for the people that are buying used cars, for middle class Canadians, whether it's a single parent that needs to get a minivan to shuttle the kids around, the young people, especially in a rural area like much of my riding, that might need a car to even have a job to get to and from work. This has been incredibly destructive and disruptive. It's really been one of the most significant incidences of inflation that we see because of how much a car costs. It's the second most expensive item most people will ever buy in their lives behind a home. So it's never struck me as fair or reasonable that every single time a used car is sold, the government has its hand out to collect its cut. When a new car is purchased off the dealership lot, you pay HST on it. In the case of Ontario, wherever you are, you pay the federal provincial sales tax where it exists. But when it's used, it's also taxed again. Now, if one person sells a car to another, that tax that you pay at registration is all provincial. But if you buy a used car at a dealership, you're paying a full freight on taxes, and 5% of that goes to the federal government. And sometimes that means the same car is being taxed 3, 4, 5 times over its lifespan. So we need to put an end to double taxation and triple taxation, but also really provide a concrete affordability measure for middle-class Canadians. So I hope that the Used Car Tax Cut Act, which will be coming up for debate in the fall, will get broad support from across party lines, because this is really a no-brainer as far as I'm concerned.
You know, when you explain it that way, it makes a lot of sense because, I mean, the idea, you know, there's different things one could do to lower the price of cars. You could just remove taxes on all cars under a set amount, or you could give a tax credit or whatever. But the idea that a car gets taxed again and again and again and again is pretty insane, if you ask me. So, no, I think that's a good piece of initiative. Your colleague, Jamil Javani, he is sponsoring a petition that is calling on the federal government to end the perpetual creation of all these heritage months and days. And this comes amidst Liberal MP Evan Baker that's trying to get a Somali Heritage Month. We know there's all of these other heritage months and days already, but the Parliament rejected a Christian Heritage Month, despite there being all these other ones, and now potentially a Somali Heritage Month. What are your thoughts on that petition or that initiative from Jamil?
I haven't seen the petition. How many signatures does it have?
I'd have to look that up. I'm not sure. I think it's just been introduced.
No, I think we should always be listening to Canadians and whatnot. I mean, I don't. To be honest, I understand why people talk about this issue, but like, I got in here to do concrete things. And for me, my personal approach is that I wouldn't use, I get one opportunity in this parliament to introduce a private member's bill. And I chose to use mine on getting rid of the sales tax on used cars because I know that is a concrete measure that will make a tangible difference in people's lives. And for me, I just think that's personally where my priorities aligned. I got in here to do things, not just to say things. And that's where I stand on that. So I wanted something substantive. And if Mr. Baker wants to do something that's more symbolic, that's his choice. If I were a constituent, I'd be saying, hey, I can't afford groceries. What are you doing about that?
No, that's a good point, right? There's so many different things that need to be fixed in Canada, and that's what you would spend your private members bill on. I mean, there's probably some people in the Somali community that can't afford food, that can't afford gas for their cars, right? There's probably other things that you could do if you actually wanted to help these people. Andrew, Parliament's about to rise for the summer. Looking back on this sitting, what stood out to you? And also, what are you looking forward to the most during the summer break?
Well, it's not a summer break for me. I'm going to be going full freight ahead. It's as I said, when you're a member of parliament, you have two full-time jobs. One's in Ottawa, one's in the riding, but I'll be shifting my attention to that. Really, my first priority and my first loyalty is to the people who elected me, the people of Elgin County, of St. Thomas, of London. And, I want to spend time making sure that I have my finger on the pulse of the concerns of my community. And I have a bit of South London. I have St. Thomas, which is a community of 40 some odd thousand. I've got rural people. I've got farmers in manufacturing. I've got middle-class families. I've got a range of the very people we see in this country who right now are struggling. And I want to make sure that I'm being responsive and transparent and accountable to their concerns. So I'm going to be spending a lot of the summer really just talking to people in the riding, going to community events. And obviously I'll be keeping my finger on the pulse on pieces of legislation I've taken an interest in. I might have to stop by some car dealerships and talk about Bill C-285, the Used Car Tax Cut Act. But it's an opportunity to be around normal people. I think the longer you're in Ottawa, the more disconnected you can be from the actual experiences of ordinary Canadians. So I always say every weekend when I go home to the riding, it's good to get the Ottawa off of me. And on the summer, I think it's really important as well to make sure that the people that we are working on behalf of in Ottawa, that their voices are top of mind in everything we do as MPs and certainly everything I do personally.
Well, Andrew, it's always a pleasure. Thanks so much for everything you do, and I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
All right. Thanks a lot, Ellie. Keep up the good work.
And this concludes our interview with MP Andrew Lawton. I want to know what you think, so put your thoughts in the comments below. I also have a little petition to tell the Liberals to stop trampling on our freedom of speech and religious freedoms. So if you could sign that would mean a lot. Be sure you're subscribed, like and hype the video. Consider becoming a paid channel member. And until next time, God bless.